Even 23. Even when intoxicated, Bernard Mickey Wrangle was a master of blast. He planted the dynamite in such a place and in such a way, breaking 4 sticks in half, then laying them outside the walls at 20-foot intervals, that the Pioneer Inn shook like a wet mutt. Every window in one end of it shattered. Wallboards cracked, lighting fixtures and potted plants plummeted to the meeting hall floor. Smoke and dust roiled for half an hour, and saucerites scorched and scratched, scattered as if the Jewish mothership had landed in their midst, spraying scalding jets of chicken soup, yet not one person was seriously hurt. On one hand, it was a masterpiece of delicate dynamiting. On the other, a faux pas. When he awoke Monday morning, much to his hangover's delight, a hangover without a head to torment is like a philanthropist without an institution to endow, and learned that he'd dropped his load in the wrong bin. The sheepest expression of the premature ejaculator crossed his face. At breakfast, where, hoping to avoid attention, he tried to conceal from his fellow diners that he was pouring beer over his Wheaties, he said to himself, "Yikes." Then he said to himself, "Yikes" again, not pausing to ponder that there might be 3 mantras. Yikes, that was close. Of course, close calls are the only calls an outlaw should accept, but oh, my woodpecker, that business last night bordered on the crazed. Considering the tequila level of my gorge and the number of human coconuts that hula around the La Hyena at every hour of the clock, it's a miracle I wasn't seen. Yes, even in the last quarter of the 20th century, miracles occurred, although this was not one of them. There was a witness to Bernard's deed. Old Julieta had watched the whole thing. 24. To Julieta, indoor plumbing was the devil's device. Of all the follies of the modern world, that one struck her as most unnecessary. There was something unnatural, foolish, about a little filthy about going indoors. On the European estates where she was reared, it was common practice for servant girls to lift their skirts outside. Julieta had seen no reason to alter her habits in Seattle. Despite the difficulty there of doing one's natural duty without being rained upon or receiving from a blackberry bramble a bite as sharp as hemorrhoids, she felt comfortable, happy, even, when she could squat in fresh air. Besides, it was an opportune way to spy frogs. Leaving Cherie in their room, poring over programs and press releases, the old woman had gone out looking for a sensible spot to void her bladder. The soft, warm, sweet lanai night seemed perfectly suited for that. The Pioneer Inn, unfortunately, was in downtown Lahaina and had no grounds. It had a courtyard, however, which at 11 p.m. on Sunday had been fairly deserted, so Julieta had slipped into the banana trees next to a wall and dropped her drawers. Before she could direct a stream, Bernard had slipped into the foliage not 20 feet away from her. She thought he'd come for a piss as well, and that she was fine with her. But the length of the thing he pulled out of his jeans almost made her gasp. When he snapped it in half, she did gasp. She was small. She knew how to sit very still, like a toad, undetected, holding her water. She had watched the whole thing. After the fuse was lit, the woodpecker flew, yanking up her bloomers. Julieta fled too. She returned to the room just as the explosion sounded. Suddenly, she knew what it was like to pee indoors. 25. In the world according to the positivist, the inspiring thing about scrambled eggs is that any way you turn them, they're sunny side up. In the world according to the existentialist, the hopeless thing about scrambled eggs is that any way you turn them, they're scrambled. In the world according to the outlaw, it was Wheaties with beer for breakfast, and who cared which crossed the road first, the chicken or the egg? But any way you turned the geotherapy carefest, you had to notice that Bernard's blast had indirectly scrambled it. With Pioneer Inn's meeting hall in bad state of repair, with cops, news people, and curiosity seekers milling about the place like bargain-minded lemmings at a suicide sale, and with the hotel management indulging a nasty attack of nerves, conference organizers spent all of Monday attempting to relocate. They had a half-hearted effort to obtain space at one or another of the luxury hotels a few miles up the coast at Kanapali, and were partially relieved to learn that there wasn't room. Old, wooden, and South Sea funky, the Pioneer Inn had been far better suited to the sensibilities of the Carefest. This was, in truth, the first time since its opening in 1901 that the Pioneer was to host a formal convention. A fact that appealed to the Carefest staff, but an error the inn was not likely to repeat. At last, on Tuesday, Lahaina officials granted permission for the World Rescuers to convene under the giant banyan tree, whose branches covered 3/4 of an acre in the city park. Terrific. Many consider this an even more appropriate site than the Pioneer Inn, which, after all, was built to cater originally to the whaling trade, an irony not lost on those carefesters to whom preservation of whales and dolphins was an important and rather emotional goal. By the time anything could get organized beneath the banyan tree, it was already Wednesday. The week was half shot, and a number of the luminaries who were to address the gathering had left or had decided not to attend. Many simply couldn't adjust their busy schedules to the amended program. A few were put off by the UFO delegates, including the visiting couple from Argonne, who remained on the scene, signed and bruised, babbling rumors of the most astonishing conspiracies and plots, while others were worried about the possibility of further explosions. A not unreasonable concern, considering that the Woodpecker was still on Maui with 3 sticks of dynamite left in his clothes. 26. For her part, Princess Cherie spent many hours dragging a freshly sunburned finger up and down the list of scheduled speakers. Dick Gregory, Marshall McLuhan, Michio Kushi, Laura Huxley, Ram Dass, David Brower, John Lilly, Murray Gell-Mann, Joseph Campbell, Elizabeth Kubler-Ross, Marcel Marceau, et al., wondering who would or would not show. By all rights, the princess should have been enjoying her beloved Hawaii, Carefest or no, but it was Julieta who romped in the surf while her young mistress sat in the shade. Redheads do burn easily. Of this or that coetry, checking and rechecking lists and pouting like the koa itself, whose leaves resemble lips or the crescents of moon. There was one black cloud in all the Hawaiian Islands, and it parked over her head. She was disappointed, to say the least, by the scrambling of the Carefest, and considering her disappointments of the past year, she was beginning to suspect that she might be jinxed. She wondered if Julieta hadn't been bringing that frog along to protect her. God damn it, she said, a princess deserves better than this. As if to sandpaper her burn, an oddly beautiful woman in a turban and robe stopped her in the lobby to inform her, above the noise of workmen busily replacing a glass window, that on the planet Argon, redheads were considered evil, and that if she had any plans for space travel, she better change her ways. Red hair is caused by sugar and lust, the woman who is blonde confided. Highly evolved beings do not indulge in sugar and lust. It was a rude thing to say, particularly in Hawaii, where sugar and lust surpassed even pineapples and marijuana as cash crops. And since Cherie only recently had begun to eliminate those very sweets and meats from her life, without any thought to her status on Argon, the woman's accusations made her defensive, and caused an unreasonable guilt to darken the hue of her gloom. She rolled around paradise like 4 bald tires on an ambulance. Late Tuesday afternoon, there occurred 3 events to retread her mood. 1. Ralph Nader checked into the Pioneer Inn, announcing that he would speak the next evening as scheduled in Banyan Park. 2. A reporter from People magazine asked her for an interview, and for the first time she felt she had something to say to those media representatives who had tried off and on for years to make some kind of story out of her. 3. Julieta, looking as skinny and blue as a jailhouse tattoo as she bounded from the ever-chill ocean in her bikini, pointed out to her a man on the beach, and through gesture and onomatopoeia, boom boom is boom boom in any land. Boom boom is boom boom in any land. Dynamite speaks a universal lingo. Identified him as the bomber. The princess didn't hesitate. She walked right up to the man and placed him under citizen's arrest. 27. Little did Cherie know that she was arresting a man whom half a dozen American sheriffs had sworn on family Bibles to see dead, that she had nabbed a fugitive who had eluded the greediest nets of the FBI for a decade. All told, although it must be admitted that in recent years, with social climate altered and Bernard inactive, interest in his capture had waned. Cherie had heard of the Woodpecker, of course, but in the days when he was making headlines by blowing up draft boards and induction centers. The last days of the Vietnam War, she'd been a schoolgirl picking blackberries, cuddling teddy bears, listening to a certain bedtime story, yellowing her nose with buttercups. Curiously, excited by an enema that Julieta had administered to her Queen Tilly's orders, Cherie had masturbated for the first time on the very evening of Bernard's most infamous exploit, and the confusing pleasure of secret fingering, the fresh flush that heated her cheeks, the vague mental images of nasty games with boys, the sticky dew that smelled of frog water and clung like prehensile pearls to the thickening buzz around her peach fish. This mysterious and shaming little ache of ecstasy eclipsed the less personal events of the day, including the news that the notorious Woodpecker had demolished an entire building on the campus of a large Midwestern university. Bernard Mickey Wrangle had sneaked into Madison, Wisconsin, in the deep of night. His hair was red then, red being the color of emergency and roses, red being the prelate's top and the baboon's bottom, red being the blood's color, jelly's color, red maddening the bull, red bringing the bull down, red being the color of Valentine's, of left-handedness, and of a small princess's new-found guilty hobby. His hair was red, his cowboy boots muddy, his heart a hive of musical bees. Aided and abetted by the Woodpecker gang, he blew up the chemistry building at the University of Wisconsin. Allegedly, work performed in that building was helpful to the war the United States government was then waging in Southeast Asia. The explosion occurred at 3 o'clock in the morning. The building was supposed to have been unoccupied. Unfortunately, a graduate student was in one of the laboratories, completing research that was to lead to his doctorate. The diligent student was found in the rubble, not all of him, but enough to matter. Confined to a wheelchair, he became a stereo jockey in a Milwaukee disco, trading snappy patter with good timing office workers and playing Barry White records as if he believed in them. He might have been a decent scientist. His project, which was obliterated by the blast, was the perfection of an oral contraceptive for men. Bernard made it safely back to the west. Only the radio news reports followed him to the hideout behind the waterfall. For once, the reports failed to entertain him. "I took a man's legs," he said to Montana Judy. "I took his manhood. I took his memory. And I took his career. Worse, I took his wife, who split when he ran out of the manhood and career. Worse still, I might have spoiled chances for a male pill. Yikes. I've got to pay. I deserve to pay. But I'll pay in my way, not society's. As bad as I am, there isn't a judge who's good enough to sentence me." Another penitent might have joined a grubby religious cult, or stood in a dark alley waiting for someone to come along and knock him on the head. As his payment, Bernard embarked on a chemical research project of his own. He tracked down, investigated, and tested various esoteric methods of birth control. "Who knows," he told Montana Judy, "maybe I'll come up with something better than that poor bozo's pill." In herbal literature, it is written that comfrey is good for sprains and fit root for spasms. Cascara will end constipation. Wild cherry restore loss of speech. For nosebleed, buckthorn is recommended. And for pneumonia, try skunk cabbage. If you're stricken with sexual desire, the cure prescribed is lily root. And assuming that lily root fails, is unavailable, or is forsaken in the delirium of the illness, squavine, spikenard, and raspberry leaves all make childbirth a little easier. Western herbal literature is oddly lacking in contraceptive advice, Bernard discovered. Oddly lacking. He suspected tampering by the church, but Bernard suspected the church of a great many things. In the anthropological texts that he pilfered from public libraries on both sides of the Rockies, it was told how the influence of tree spirits and water nymphs would promote fecundity, and though Bernard did not doubt that, female members of the Woodpecker gang demonstrated a decided tendency toward fecundity out there in the wilderness, where tree spirits abounded. He wondered where the deities were who guarded against the knockup, the Eskimo of the Bering Strait, the Hoyokol of Mexico, the Nishnam Indians of California, the Caffrey tribes of South Africa, the Basuto and the Maori and the Ano all made dolls in the likeness of the infant that was wanted, and the act of homeopathic magic brought pregnancy galloping. But what image could be fashioned to hold would-be embryos at bay? A decoction of wasps' nest was administered internally to Klungen brides to make them as prolific as insects. How much of a rhinoceros would a bride have to eat in order to emulate that animal's habit of infrequent offspring? In ancient times, when a people's success its survival, perhaps, depended upon steady multiplication, all available magic was marshaled in the promotion of fertility. It was only after the Industrial Revolution that some deterrent to fertility gradually began to become widely desirable for whole societies rather than occasional unlucky lovers. And by the last quarter of the 20th century, when overpopulation was a major threat to the planet, there was no longer any magic to command. Or was there? Maybe in Asia. Bernard saw on television in a bar in Boulder, in a program called You Asked For It, some remarkable documentary footage. There was a village somewhere in India on the outskirts of which a large albino cobra lived in the rocks. For years the snake had played a starring role in a unique fertility rite. The barren women of the village had to make a pilgrimage to the white cobra's den. There they had to kiss him on top of the head, yet it wasn't enough to kiss him. To guarantee conception, they had to kiss the cobra twice. The village lost a good many of its infertile women. Bernard was fascinated by that powerful scene. He thought it would make a great breath mint commercial. You know, if she kisses you once, will she kiss you again? Bernard mailed a suggestion to the Searts Company. Searts responded that his judgment was questionable, not to mention his taste. Montana Judy said the same. From India, however, he gathered information that a tea brewed from the pennyroyal and myrrh would interfere with conception up to 7 days after the act. He went at once to an herb shop in Missoula and shoplifted the ingredients. East Indian sources also supplied the intelligence that regular ingestion of carrot seed was a birth control method whose effectiveness had been proven by countless generations of Hindu women. Reference to countless generations did not reassure him, but he acquired carrot seeds from a farmer's supply store near Billings and was damn near caught in the process. Obtaining the astringent ingredients used in Shilink, the traditional Chinese herbal contraceptive, further taxed the woodpecker's ingenuity, for preparation of Shilink required Cherie date, Shilink flour, ling shook root, and gomsochu leaf, the four immortals. For God's sake. Naturally, the Food and Drug Administration frowned upon the introduction of Shilink formula to America. Bernard was forced to jimmy the locks of Chinese doctors as far west as San Francisco to get his freckled paws on some ling shook. Even so, he abandoned Shilink as abruptly as carrot seeds and pennyroyal when he learned of lunaception, a drugless method of pinpointing ovulation by training women to resynchronize their cycles with those of the moon. Lunaception landed like an astronaut on the green cheese of Bernard's imagination. Everything about it sounded right to him, especially its lunar foundation. Outlaws, like lovers, poets, and tubercular composers who cough blood onto piano keys, do their finest work in the slippery rays of the moon. Mythologically, woodpeckers are connected to Mars, the redhead planet. But the woodpecker, more so than any delegate to the aborted UFO convention, had a private line to the moon. On second thought, everything about lunaception didn't please Bernard. Lunaception, as Shilink, pennyroyal, and carrot seeds, placed the burden of responsibility for birth control on the woman. Thus, for all of its potential effectiveness, it failed to completely compensate for the loss of the male pill. If Bernard was bothered by that, Montana Judy was bothered more. Understandably, Bernard had scant access to subjects for contraceptive testing. Who was going to trust an amateur gynecologist, particularly one whose credentials included the 10 most wanted list? Montana Judy grew sick of being a guinea pig for Bernard's experiments, and she was unrelieved when he explained his testing to include her younger sisters, the twins, Montana Molly and Montana Polly. Bernard, you see, personally supplied and delivered the squirmy sauce that was the activating agent in the tests. Montana Judy decided that Bernard should pay his debt to society in a more conventional fashion. Montana Judy turned him in. That book that judges are said to throw at offenders, the rule book, presumably, a Russian novel, possibly no elegant volumes of verse, certainly, was hurled like a beanball at the red bean of Bernard Mickey Wrangle. He was sentenced to 30 years. The last quarter of the 20th century might be destined to limp into history, but at least there'd be no Woodpecker around to drill holes in its crutches. Aware of his reputation for exits, the federal penitentiary at McNeil Island, Washington, locked him up quite tight. It took him more than a year to blow out. In his absence, the world had changed. It was only fair. Bernard himself had changed. For example, observation of his colleagues in prison had convinced him that thievery, inspired by the basest human impulses, was unbecoming to an outlaw. Let businessmen and riffraff rob and cheat. He vowed never to steal again, unless it was necessary. He also vowed to behave more sensitively toward women, beginning with Montana Judy. Could he find her? He couldn't. He had joined a gang of equally minded women that spent its evenings terrorizing men, equally regardless of their degrees of guilt or innocence. These women would accept men only as subservient flunkies. And while Bernard knew only too well that was how many men had treated many women for many centuries, he couldn't see a mere reversal of rotten roles as being very equalizing or very helpful to anyone. Moreover, he was nobody's flunky, not even the Moon's. Montana Polly had joined the same mob of Avengers. Montana Molly was enrolled in Spokane Success, a secretarial college. The Woodpecker gang had disbanded. 4 former members were in jail. One had been clubbed to death while folding chairs by members of an American Legion post in Jackson Hole. 3 had embraced conventional politics and were working within the system to alter the system. 1 was selling real estate and had contracted Jesus Christ as his personal savior. Willie the Wetback was studying pre-law at Stanford. He was in a fraternity, starving his nose, although he still smoked grass occasionally. He wanted to work for Nader one day. The world had changed. Bernard was perplexed. He missed the thrills and chills and spills. Just because the war was over, did that mean everybody had to stop having fun? Thanks to Montana Judy, the hideout behind the waterfall was hot. Bernard went underground in Seattle. He got a job mixing drinks in a bar frequented by off-duty policemen. Some nights there were dozens of cops in that place. Their presence sprinkled a little spice in his life, added a tiny tickle of amusement. He poured cheap bourbon and bided his time. A writer published an open letter to Bernard in a leading liberal periodical. He requested an interview. Utmost secrecy was sworn. It was on the level. The writer was a man of proven courage and integrity. The writer wanted amnesty for dissidents such as Bernard. He said that Bernard had suffered enough. He wrote that living underground was no less punishing than prison. A person underground exists in a state of controlled schizophrenia, he wrote. Terror never slackens. The journalist considered Bernard a victim of the Vietnam War. The fact that he has acted against the government's interests instead of in them was immaterial, the writer said. The socio-political realities that drove Bernard to risk his life bombing induction centers were essentially the same as those that led other young men to risk theirs trading shots and rice paddies. As a fugitive, on the run, living in disguise and fear, Bernard was no less a casualty than those poor veterans who had left prime cuts from their physiques to decay in Da Nang and Hua. Ha ha, that's how Bernard's infamous response began. Ha ha. Victim? The difference between a criminal and an outlaw is that while criminals frequently are victims, outlaws never are. Indeed, the first step towards becoming a true outlaw is the refusal to be victimized. All people who live subject to other people's laws are victims. People who break laws out of greed, frustration, or vengeance are victims. People who overturn laws in order to replace them with their own laws are victims. I am speaking here of revolutionaries. We outlaws, however, live beyond the law. We don't merely live beyond the letter of the law. Many businessmen, most politicians, and all cops do that. We live beyond the spirit of the law. In a sense, then, we live beyond society. We have a common goal. That goal is to turn the tables on the nature of society. When we succeed, we raise the exhilaration content of the universe. We even raise it a little bit when we fail. Victim? I deplore the ugliness of the Vietnam War, but what I deplored, others have deplored before me. When war turns whole populations into sleepwalkers, outlaws don't join forces with alarm clocks. Outlaws, like poets, rearrange the nightmare. It is elating work. The years of the war were the most glorious of my life. I wasn't risking my skin to protest a war. I risked my skin for fun, for beauty. I love the magic of TNT, how eloquently it speaks, its resounding rumble, its clap. Its quack is scarcely less deep than the passionate moan of the earth herself. A well-timed series of detonations is like a choir of quakes. For all its fluent resonance, a bomb says only one word, surprise, and then applauds itself. I love the hot hands of explosion. I love a breeze perfumed with the devil's smell of powder, so close in its effect to the angel smell of sex. I love the way that the architecture under the impetus of dynamite dissolves almost in slow motion, crumbling delicately, shedding bricks like feathers, corners melting, grim facades breaking into grins, supports shrugging and calling it a day, tons of totalitarian dreck washing away in the wake of a circular tsunami of air. I love that precious portion of a second when window glass becomes elastic and bulges out like bubblegum before popping. I love public buildings made public at last. Doors. I love public buildings made public at last. Doors flung open to the citizens, to the creatures, to the universe. Baby, come on in. And I love the final snuff of smoke. Yes, and I love the trite mythos of the outlaw. I love the self-conscious romanticism of the outlaw. I love the black wardrobe of the outlaw. I love the face smile of the outlaw. I love the tequila of the outlaw and the beans of the outlaw. I love the way respectable men sneer and say outlaw. I love the way young women palpitate and say outlaw. The outlaw boat sails against the flow, and I love it. Outlaw's toilet where badgers toilet, and I love it. All outlaws are photogenic, and I love that. When freedom is outlawed, only outlaws will be free. That's a graffito seen in Anna Cortez, and I love that. There are outlaw maps that lead to outlaw treasures, and I love those maps especially. Unwilling to wait for mankind to improve, the outlaw lives as if that day were here, and I love that most of all. Victim. Your letter reminded the woodpecker that he is a woodpecker blessed. Your sympathies for my loneliness, tension, and disturbing fluctuations in identity have some basis in fact and are humbly appreciated. But do not be misled. I am the happiest man in America. In my bartender's pockets I still carry, out of habit, wooden matches. As long as there are matches, there will be fuses. As long as there are fuses, no walls are safe. As long as every wall is threatened, the world can happen. Outlaws are can openers in the supermarket of life.